Hitler's top generals learned about Hiroshima while locked inside what looked like a quiet English farmhouse. They thought they were safely hidden away, forgotten by the world. Instead, every word they spoke was being secretly recorded. August 6, 1945. Farm Hall, England. To the locals, it was just a country estate. To British intelligence, it was a cage for some of the most dangerous minds in Europe. 10 of Hitler's top nuclear scientists and a handful of high-ranking generals. They believed they were simply waiting out the end of the war, cut off from the front, from Berlin, from everything. What they didn't know was that the walls had ears. Behind the wallpaper, in ceilings and lamps, tiny microphones were hidden. Every conversation, every argument, every late-night confession was captured and sent straight to Allied intelligence officers hungry for answers. Were the Germans close to building an atomic bomb? How far had Hitler really gotten? That evening, a British officer stepped into their common room holding a simple radio bulletin that would change history. Calmly, almost casually, he informed them, "An American bomb has destroyed the Japanese city of Hiroshima. One bomb, one city, gone." The reaction that followed was so raw, so unexpected, that the British had trouble believing it themselves. And what those microphones captured next would reveal why Nazi Germany never truly stood a chance. At first, the room didn't explode with panic. It cracked with disbelief. Some of the German scientists actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded absurd. An entire city wiped out by a single bomb? That wasn't physics, that was fantasy. Others went quiet, their faces tightening as if they were trying to hear something behind the officer's words. The generals exchanged glances but said nothing. One man stepped into the center of it all without moving from his chair. Werner Heisenberg, Germany's top physicist, the architect of Hitler's nuclear program. To the others, he wasn't just another scientist, he was the man who was supposed to deliver the future. Heisenberg frowned. "That's impossible," he said flatly. "The Americans don't have the technology." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. "Of course they don't. This must be propaganda." Another Allied trick to humiliate Germany, to make them believe they were beaten by magic instead of armies. One scientist scoffed that it sounded like some clumsy attempt to copy German radio drama. But the British officer didn't back down. He began giving details. Not just headlines, numbers, the explosive power, the size of the fireball, the radius of destruction, the strange after-effects. People burned without flames, buildings vaporized, shadows etched into concrete. Radiation. Heisenberg's expression changed. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something colder. "Calculation. Paper," he demanded. "And a pencil." Somebody slid a notebook over to him. The room fell completely silent. No one laughed now. No one joked about propaganda. They watched as Heisenberg bent over the table, his hand moving fast, filling the page with numbers, formulas, and hurried corrections. Every scrape of the pencil felt like a countdown. Minutes turned into an hour. Men paced the floor, whispered in corners, stared out the windows into the dark English night. A few clung desperately to the idea that it had to be fake. Others, listening to the officer's precise description, felt a knot of dread grow tighter. Finally, Heisenberg stopped. He put the pencil down, staring at his own calculations as if they were a verdict. "It's real," he whispered. "They actually did it." The air in the room seemed to collapse. Voices erupted questions, protests, curses. Otto Hahn looked stunned. Some scientists were pale, others flushed with anger or shame. But beneath all the noise, one terrifying question burned in every mind. If we started first, if we had the best scientists, how did America beat us to the bomb? The shouting didn't start all at once. It began with a single broken sentence. "I invented this." Otto Hahn murmured. Hahn, the quiet chemist who had helped discover nuclear fission back in 1938, was staring at the floor as if it might open beneath him. The others had always respected him, even teased him gently as the mild man at the birth of a terrifying idea. Now, hearing that his discovery had led to a weapon that could erase a city, he looked physically ill. 100,000 people, he said hoarsely. Maybe more, because of this. He stood up abruptly. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room. A couple of the scientists exchanged worried glances. One whispered that someone should check on him, that he might harm himself. The weight of guilt pressed heavier than any prison walls. Back in the common room, guilt quickly turned into something easier to carry: blame. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker spoke first, his voice sharp. This is what happens when a government starves its own research. They never gave us enough money, never gave us enough priority. We were always begging for equipment, for staff, for support. He sat down. Kurt Diebner snapped back almost instantly. That's nonsense. We had money. We had resources. The problem wasn't the government. The problem was what we did with them. We made the wrong choices. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. The room fractured into factions, those who blamed Berlin, those who blamed bad strategy, those who blamed fate. Heisenberg, still shaken by his own calculations, tried to defend his work. We focused on reactors, not bombs, he insisted. We were trying to build energy, not weapons. That was our direction. It sounded noble, almost too noble. Several men glanced at each other. Was that really the whole truth? Or was it a way to soften the failure, to pretend they had chosen a different path on purpose? The hidden microphones captured not only their words, but the hesitation between them. Some of the scientists, deep down, seemed almost relieved they hadn't built such a weapon for Hitler. Others felt nothing but anger and humiliation. Finally, one voice cut through the confusion. Paul Hartek, blunt as always, spoke the words everyone had been avoiding. We were simply behind, he said. The Americans were better, faster, more organized. We have to accept it. The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. They had lost the nuclear race, and for the first time, they were starting to realize it wasn't just about equations in a notebook. That night, while the others drifted into uneasy arguments and half slept on stiff beds, Werner Heisenberg didn't stop. The news from Hiroshima had torn a hole in his understanding of the war, and he needed to know how big that hole really was. He hunched over a table in the dim light, page after page, filling with equations, chain reactions, critical masses, neutron cross-sections. The numbers weren't unfamiliar, but now they had a new weight. Somewhere across the ocean, those same numbers had already been turned into a weapon. By morning, Heisenberg had something like an answer. He called the others together. Men stumbled in, unshaven and tired, still replaying the previous night's conversation in their minds. Some expected him to say there had been a mistake, that the calculations didn't add up. Instead, he began calmly, like a professor starting a lecture. There are two basic designs they could have used, he said. Uranium or plutonium. Both are possible. But for this scale, for this speed, he tapped the paper. They must have separated uranium-235. The room went quiet again. Every man there knew what that meant. Uranium-235 doesn't just fall into your hands. It has to be painstakingly separated from the far more common uranium-238. It's like trying to pull a few thousand special grains out of a mountain of sand. We tried, one scientist muttered. Centrifuges, small experiments, but it was slow, too expensive, too fragile. Heisenberg nodded. Exactly. Our method could never reach the necessary scale. Not in time. Not in this war. He described what the Americans must have built. Enormous industrial plants using gaseous diffusion, miles of piping, endless rows of machines humming day and night. Entire factories whose only purpose was to strip out tiny quantities of uranium, 2, 3, 5, gram by gram, until they had enough to turn theory into fire. We never had anything close to that, Heisenberg admitted quietly. The others could picture it now, even if they'd never seen it. Brand new cities rising in the desert or the hills, guarded by fences and soldiers, filled with workers who didn't even know what they were really building. Thousands of people, billions of dollars, all focused on one single goal. We were working in basements, one of the scientists said bitterly. They were working in factories the size of towns. The contrast was brutal and humiliating. This wasn't just a story of who had the brightest minds. It was a story of who could build the biggest machine around those minds, who could turn genius into industry. As that realization sank in, another presence stirred in the background. The generals, who had been listening quietly all this time, were about to speak, and what one of them said next would change the mood in that room completely. The scientists weren't the only ones trapped inside Farm Hall. Sharing the same walls, eating the same bland meals, walking the same fenced-in yard, were 3 German generals. They had listened quietly through the panic, the guilt, the calculations. For hours, they'd said almost nothing. Now, one of them finally stepped forward. General Erich von Stein straightened in his chair, his voice calm in a room still vibrating with emotion. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are all missing the point." The arguing stopped. Every head turned toward him. "You're talking about calculations, budgets, equipment," von Stein continued. "But this bomb doesn't just end the war with Japan. It ends the war everywhere." The scientists frowned. Some looked confused, others defensive. To them, the atomic bomb was still a technical achievement, a question of physics and engineering. To von Stein, it was something else entirely. "Whoever has this weapon," he said slowly, "controls the world." He let the words hang there. There won't be traditional wars anymore. No more tank battles decided by fuel. No more trenches. No more grinding offensives. There will be threats, leverage, fear. There. It not said. The scientists exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't thought it through like that. They'd been obsessed with reactors and formulas, not with what happened when you could erase a city with a single bomb. "America," von Stein went on, "now holds more power than any empire in history combined." The room went silent. Even Heisenberg, who had just reverse-engineered the bomb's design, didn't argue. The generals weren't impressed by equations. They saw something more brutal. A permanent shift in global power. Then, von Stein's tone changed. Colder, more analytical. "And even if we had built it first," he said, "we still would have lost." A few of the scientists bristled. "Why?" one of them demanded. "We had the head start. We had the talent." If Berlin had listened, von Stein cut him off. "America has 130 million people. We had barely 70 million. They have oceans protecting them from invasion. We were surrounded on all sides. They could afford to pour resources into a single project. We were bleeding men and fuel on every front." He gestured toward Heisenberg's notes. "Your bomb needs stability, safety, time. They had it. We didn't." The numbers backed him up. Germany's nuclear effort had maybe 100 real scientists and a fraction of the necessary factories. The Manhattan Project had more than 130,000 workers and a budget 40 times larger. Billions of dollars. Entire cities built from scratch just to feed the atom. "We never stood a chance," one scientist whispered. Von Stein nodded, almost gently. The war was lost before it began. Not just on the battlefield, but in the foundations of our state. But as the realization settled over them, another question emerged, one all of them had been avoiding. If the structure of Germany was broken from the start, who broke it? Their thoughts turned, inevitably, to one man, The conversation in the common room shifted, slowly but inevitably, toward the man whose shadow still hung over all of them. Hitler. For a while, no one wanted to say his name. They circled around it. The leadership, Berlin, the party, until Werner Heisenberg finally broke the silence. "I met him," Heisenberg said quietly. "In 1942, the others turned toward him. Some knew the story in fragments. Few had heard it in full. I tried to explain nuclear weapons," Heisenberg continued. "The theory, the scale of the project, what it would require, the time." He paused, remembering every detail of that tense meeting in the Reich Chancellery. The heavy air, the impatience in Hitler's eyes. He asked me, "How long?" Heisenberg looked down at his hands. I told him, "At least 3 years. Maybe more. It would require huge resources, entire factories, thousands of workers, uninterrupted research." He gave a bitter half-smile. He waved his hand. "Too long," he said. "I need weapons now." The generals nodded grimly. This sounded exactly like the man they had served. Hitler didn't care for invisible progress or long-term projects. He wanted miracles he could parade in front of cameras, rockets streaking into the sky, jet fighters slicing through clouds, super-heavy tanks crushing everything in front of them. Things that looked impressive, things he understood. He thought nuclear physics was Jewish science, one scientist said. His voice edged with anger. He never trusted it. 8. Another added, "And then he drove out half of our best minds." The list wasn't short. Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi's wife was Jewish. Dozens of others. Many of them harassed, threatened, dismissed from their posts, forced to flee. They didn't vanish. They boarded ships and trains. And where did they go? "America," someone said. The word hung there like a sentence. "We gave them our greatest weapon," another scientist whispered. "Our own brilliant minds." And Hitler let them walk away. It wasn't just personnel. Hitler's paranoia strangled cooperation. Projects were split. Rival groups were pitted against each other. Resources were hoarded by whoever shouted loudest or flattered best. Long-term planning died under the weight of constant emergency. "He destroyed our chances himself," Heisenberg said, the bitterness now open. "Through stupidity, through hatred, through arrogance." The generals said nothing, but their faces told the story. They had watched the same madness from the military side, orders made on impulse, strategies driven by ideology instead of reality, enemies created faster than victories. The Hiroshima bomb had exposed a harsh truth. Germany hadn't just been beaten by better factories or bigger budgets. It had been crippled from within by its own leader. And yet, as the night wore on, an even colder realization settled over them. Maybe they never could have built the bomb at all. Not in that system. Not in that world. By the time the lights dimmed at Farm Hall, and the conversation slowed to a tired murmur, one conclusion had crystallized in that bugged English mansion. Germany had never really been in the race. Not the true race. Not the one that ended in a blinding white flash over Hiroshima. The scientists went over the numbers again, almost as if they were trying to argue with reality. Germany's nuclear program, maybe 100 serious researchers, scattered across different institutes, tugged between the army, the bureaucracy, and the SS. Limited budgets, constant shortages, bombed-out laboratories. America's Manhattan Project. More than 130,000 people. Entire towns like Oak Ridge and Hanford built from nothing. A budget of roughly $2 billion, about 40 times what Germany had spent. Entire trainloads of material. Power plants dedicated just to feeding the project. Factories the size of small cities, devoted to a single purpose. "Even if we had been perfectly organized," one scientist said quietly, "we still couldn't match that." Reverend Doles. And that was the painful heart of it. The atom bomb didn't just demand clever equations, it demanded stability, wealth, security, things the Third Reich never truly had. While German scientists were evacuating laboratories and dodging air raids, their American counterparts worked behind guarded fences, supplied with everything they needed. Dictatorship, they realized, was not strength. It was a trap. Hitler's racism had driven out their finest minds. His impatience had strangled long-term research. His paranoia had shattered cooperation and split projects into jealous, competing fiefdoms. Under him, science was never just science. It was politics, ideology, fear. Even if we had finished a bomb, General von Stein said at last. What then? By the time it was ready, Berlin would already be burning. No one argued. They had all lived through the collapse. Silence settled over the room. All their careers, all their brilliance, all the long nights in laboratories and lecture halls had led here, to being prisoners in an English house, listening to the news that another country had achieved the thing their own leader had never truly believed in. America won with democracy, one voice said softly, with resources, with people they welcomed instead of persecuted. And we lost with dictatorship, another added, with poverty, with hatred. Somewhere in a hidden room, the British microphones captured one final question. What happens now? Someone asked. Von Stein's reply was almost a sigh. Now, he said, we live in America's world, and we pray they use this power wisely. Hitler never heard about Hiroshima. He died in his bunker before the bomb fell. But his absence didn't matter. His generals' reaction, their shock, their calculations, their bitter honesty had already revealed the truth. Germany hadn't just lost the war. It had lost it long before the first atomic blast, in the moment it chose fear over reason, hatred over talent, and a dictator over a future.